Well, this is it, folks. It's the end of an era. The last cross-country Warped Tour ever is currently ongoing and is set to wrap at the beginning of August. Longtime fans and attendees are saying their final goodbyes. More than 1,700 bands have played since the Warped Tour first hit the road in 1995, and it has been the highlight of the summer for countless adolescents. Although this outcome was hardly surprising, I thought I'd give you an overview as to why this is happening now. In 2018, the Warped Tour began as a kind of ska-punk Lollapalooza, a traveling circus for avid readers of Thrasher magazine as well as underground rock enthusiasts, with considerable overlap between the two. Although it maintained this identity over time, we also saw it attempting to branch out in various ways, once in a while bringing on acts like Katy Perry and Eminem to perform. Warped Tour founder Kevin Lyman has cited declining attendance as well as personal fatigue as his main reasons for calling it quits. He also said it hasn't been fun in years. Interesting choice of words, because the festival has been racked by controversy for several years. I suspect that Lyman is subtly referring to the numerous allegations of sexual impropriety that have been leveled against various performers in recent years, including Front Porch Step, Blood on the Dance Floor, Ronnie Radke of Falling in Reverse, Slaves vocalist Johnny Craig, Pierce the Veil drummer Mike Fuentes, We Came as Romans vocalist Kyle Pavone, Ian Watkins of Lost Prophets, among others. Apparently, sexual impropriety at the Warped Tour has been an open secret for years. According to Ben Weasel, frontman of punk rock band Screeching Weasel,
I have friends, again, who have been on that tour who would tell me about the heroin overdoses backstage, about people passing around drunk underage girls like a bottle of booze, quote from a friend of mine. Okay, there's a lot of disgusting going on back there. If Kevin Lyman wanted to deal with it, if he wanted it over, it would take one staff meeting. One. He could have dealt with it. He aided and abetted in the sexual assault of God knows how many women over the years. Okay?
Now, I can't verify those claims, and I'm not making any claims myself, but I'll let you be the judge of their veracity. Kevin Lyman had been under increased pressure as of late to crack down on sexism and weed out alleged sex abusers from the performance roster. He faced a ton of criticism after allowing Front Porch Step to perform in 2015, even after allegations had surfaced, and presumably he's been wanting to make amends ever since, hoping the anger would die down. The 2017 Warped Tour was supposed to be a conciliatory gesture and an olive branch to all the women that felt slighted and victimized over the years, performers and attendees alike. Lyman invited feminist punk band War on Women to join the lineup, and they accepted. So far, so good. Unfortunately for Lyman, War on Women belong to the Riot Girl tradition that emphasizes activism over music, and their entourage became confrontational and hostile towards some of the performers. At a tour stop in Denver, an activist affiliated with War on Women and their anti-harassment project called Safer Scenes held up a sign in the audience chastising the Dickies as disgusting, predatory old men, while the Dickies were performing, no less. As you can probably guess, frontman Leonard Phillips was not too happy about this, and that's when all hell broke loose. He launched into an offensive vulgar tirade against the young woman and encouraged the entire audience to cuss her out and turn against her. This incident tore yet another rift into an already volatile and divided scene, and here was Kevin Lyman getting it from both sides. The more he tried to sit on the fence and please everybody, the more flack he took. What began as a well-intentioned attempt at placating women turned into the very kind of situation that women were desperate to avoid. Declining attendance or not, I suspect that Lyman is fed up with having to deal with all this. Why go through the trouble of booking bands, only to have to cancel on them later, or else incur the wrath of the internet for not doing so? Besides, it's getting harder and harder to find performers that aren't sex offenders, so why bother? He's probably sick of having to be a mediator in the midst of a toxic culture war, and he probably doesn't appreciate being a whipping boy and a sounding board either. It's probably just easier to give up, seeing as how there are irreconcilable differences in the punk scene that will never resolve themselves. One side wants punk to forever remain offensive, vulgar, shocking, and crass, an equal opportunity offender that rejects all authority. The other side wants punk to be a vehicle for left-wing social change and nothing else. And those two sides will never see eye to eye on that. Before moving on, I'd like to make one more statement on the allegations leveled at Kevin Lyman and various performers in recent years. Obviously, sexual assault is terrible, and any large-scale festival or organization that is thought to harbor or enable such behavior is going to have a hard time continuing in this political and social climate, especially in the aftermath of Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and the rest of the Me Too movement. Every aspect of the entertainment world is currently under a microscope of intense scrutiny and pressure, and the Warped Tour was ahead of the curve in that regard. If even a fraction of the aforementioned accusations are true, then from a moral standpoint, the Warped Tour can't continue. Nor can it continue from an amoral business standpoint, as there's now too much overhead and headache associated with it. You have diminishing returns and a cultural minefield from which to scrape them up. Not a healthy combination. For the remainder of this video, I'd like to focus on what the Warped Tour meant for music and what its demise says about current trends and tastes. For me, the end of the Warped Tour is actually really easy to understand and summarize. It just isn't 1995 anymore. The untimely demise of Kurt Cobain in 1994 left a cultural vacuum that major labels were desperate to fill. Record contracts were handed out like Halloween candy in the hopes that someone, anyone, would record the next Nevermind and go diamond. Since Nirvana emerged triumphantly out of the underground, the rationale was that other unsigned bands could make a similar impact, and record labels began an almost 3-year-long experiment that oversaturated the market with alternative rock like never before. 1994 is the year we saw the rise of Collective Soul, Sponge, Weezer, Beck, Live, Love Spit Love, Veruca Assault, Pavement, Mazzy Star, Counting Crows, and many others. The music festival circuit was crowded with up-and-coming bands, teetering on the brink of success and basking in hype and favorable press. But most importantly, for the purposes of this video, 1994 was the year of Green Day and The Offspring. Summer and fall of that year saw Basket Case and Come Out and Play become smash hits, bringing punk rock to the mainstream. Dookie eventually went diamond, and Smash became the biggest selling independent album of all time. Even Bad Religion and NoFX went gold for the first time ever during this mid-90s punk revival. Major labels began to wonder, could this music become bigger than grunge? That's where 1995 comes in. Green Day and The Offspring were more popular than ever. Radio stations and MTV began to play punk and ska bands on a regular basis. This is when mainstream audiences were first introduced to the Goo Goo Dolls, Rancid, Dancehall Crashers, Face to Face, Sublime, The Smoking Popes, Civ, No Doubt, Wax, and others. There were even bands like Presidents of the United States of America that were almost punk, and I guess Weezer fell into that category as well. Pennywise's About Time was also released in 1995, and it was their first album to chart on Billboard. The momentum was clearly building. Kevin Lyman was in the right place at the right time to take advantage of this. Green Day played both Lollapalooza and Woodstock 94 a year earlier, and the latter concert would become legendary for reasons I'll discuss later. It was clear that punk bands could energize an audience and hold their own, and up until that point they had been excluded from most major festivals. The Warped Tour was created, in part, to change all that. A festival specifically for punk bands, putting them up front and center stage in an environment where they truly belonged. A platform for up-and-coming bands that didn't have a hit yet, the ones that were just bubbling under the surface. A platform for bands on Epitaph and Fat Records, whose crossover potential in the aftermath of The Offspring and Rancid's success was seen as limitless. In the early and mid-90s, rock was still seen as a youthful, viable genre. It still had substantial cachet with rebellious teenagers, before the invention of autotune, before the ubiquity of Pro Tools, before the mainstreaming of electronica, even before the invention of mass file sharing. Forming a band was still the easiest way to make music and reach the masses, and supply was ballooning to meet this demand. As soon as Fatboy Slim, the Chemical Brothers, Prodigy, and others hit the mainstream in the late 90s, this started to change. Quickly and irreversibly. By some miracle, you still had the occasional pop-punk-ish band hitting the mainstream after that, especially in the aftermath of Blink-182's massive success in 1999. These included Sum 41, A Newfound Glory, Fall Out Boy, All American Rejects, Good Charlotte, All Time Low, Paramore, you get the idea. This was ultimately good for the Warped Tour's ticket sales, because it prolonged the festival's shelf life and kept young people interested. As long as you have new generations of kids showing up, you can carry on indefinitely. Over the years, we've seen the Warped Tour incorporate music that so-called scene kids are into. Deathcore, screamo, metalcore, and other related subgenres. A departure from the tour's origins for sure, but still doable. One thing you'll notice about these genres is that the bands and fan base have an obvious affinity for trap and electronic music. You could see this hinted at in cutesy compilations like Punk Goes Crunk from Fearless Records. Look at a band like From First to Last, who played the Warped Tour 3 years in a row from 2004 to 2006. Lead singer Sonny Moore eventually left the band, changed his name to Skrillex, and basically made dubstep a household name. The entire genres of electronicore and crunkcore perfectly illustrate the scene kids' fascination with increasingly electronic sounds. Then you have Lil Peep, a recently deceased rapper who came from an emo metalcore background, but made trap music. The writing has been on the wall for quite some time. As soon as laptops became affordable and sophisticated, as soon as Autotune and Pro Tools became ubiquitous, there was no need for bands anymore. Why bother learning an instrument and lugging all that equipment around to gigs and band practice? Who wants to deal with clashing egos and schedules? Band members having to go to rehab, or suddenly quitting, constantly having to look for suitable replacements when members just up and leave. Who needs all that hassle? Just get a laptop, press play on a pre-made beat, and you're a star. Now, I'm not saying electronic sounds should be completely off limits, but the more the Warped Tour's roster heads in that direction, the more they are at odds with the ethos of the tour itself. The Warped Tour never has been, and never should be, an electronic music festival, but sadly it's been struggling to adapt to a changing time where everyone seems to prefer electronic sounds to the real thing. If the only way the Warped Tour can continue in modern times is by rebranding itself as an EDM festival for scene kids, then why bother? Now, I'm not blaming the fans, and I'm not blaming the bands. It's just an overall sign of the times. Our entire society dances to the beat of an electronic drum, and that just doesn't fit into the Warped Tour's aesthetic. This affinity for the artificial was born out of the mainstream. Look at the so-called rock bands you see being promoted on Vivo or Vevo or whatever it's called, the ones that are still popular and relevant. How many of them are actually playing rock music? The last Linkin Park record, for example, was basically dance pop, much to the chagrin of their longtime fans. And look at Coldplay. It all sounds like thinly disguised EDM-inspired dance pop. Authentic rock music, especially underground rock, has no mainstream appeal at all. It's become obsolete, as 20-somethings and younger people seem to have an inexhaustible appetite for trap music and electronic music. There will always be underground rock being performed in basements and small clubs, but without mainstream airplay and popular appeal, you're just not going to have a favorable musical climate that can sustain a punk rock cross-country tour year after year. Now, as I promised, here's some more footage from Green Day's performance at Woodstock '94. Towards the end of their set, the audience started throwing mud at them, and they started throwing mud back, and this made their performance legendary. The whole festival would later be deemed Mudstock as people were dancing in it, bathing in it, sliding in it, throwing it, going insane. Kinda looks fun, actually. Now compare that to Sublime's performance at the Warped Tour 1 year later in New York. Look familiar? It's like the audience was trying to recapture the thrill of Woodstock '94 with the same mud throwing and general chaos. Apparently somebody in Sublime's entourage threw some mud back, which antagonized the crowd even further. The set was cut short and that was that. Why mention this? Because that's the mid-90s zeitgeist that the Warped Tour came out of. Punk, alternative, mud-throwing, all of it. Consider the headliners at the very first Warped Tour in 1995. Most of these bands were on major labels and had a lot of hype and promise behind them. No Doubt, Civ, Face to Face, Sublime, etc. These bands were getting played on K-Rock, where they were in heavy rotation on MTV, where they were charting. These weren't just random underground bands that Kevin Lyman decided to take a chance on. The Warped Tour always needed a steady stream of big-time bands with mainstream visibility to stay afloat, and the mid-90s provided a fertile environment for that to happen routinely. As the years went on, and as punk success stories became less frequent, it was becoming apparent that the Warped Tour was soon going to run out of kids to entice. The Warped Tour was basically stuck between a punk rock and a hard place. Bringing in new acts and young blood was undeniably necessary, but the new styles alienated old fans and threatened the Warped Tour's entire musical identity. The rift between the old and the new played out in the music, the politics, social issues, and everything else. Maybe the generation gap was destined to implode the entire thing. Personally, I haven't been interested in the Warped Tour for a very long time, and I don't like what it has become over the years, but a part of me was always glad it was there. Musically speaking, its namesake was familiar and reassuring, and it was evidence that punk and related genres still mattered to people. To be honest, I'm shocked that the festival lasted as long as it did. The end of the Warped Tour represents yet another nail in rock's coffin, and in that sense, I'm sorry it's ending. I'm always going to miss the period in rock history that gave birth to the Warped Tour. I hold it very near and dear to me. That being said, there's no sense in trying to recapture that thrill year after year in a cross-country tour if the world has moved on, and if young people don't care anymore. If technology has made entire genres obsolete or unappealing, then so be it, I guess. That brief moment when we thought punk and ska were going to take over the world has come and gone, and its once prosperous institutions are downsizing and hanging on by a thread. The laptop-driven DJ culture has completely supplanted it, and young people can't tell the difference. Maybe there's just no place for the Warped Tour in our politically correct, synthetic modern world. We're watching a chapter of music history close for good, and I thought it warranted more than just a passing mention and a footnote. Despite being tarnished over time, the Warped Tour bridged the gap between the mainstream and the underground, much like the mid-90s pop culture that gave rise to it. It introduced cool bands to a wider audience and gave misfits something to look forward to in the summertime. It attempted to broaden the musical horizons of its youngest attendees by introducing them to legendary classic punk bands, although that didn't always go so well. Its detractors always had legitimate gripes, but it wasn't all bad. Before rock music is completely discarded and forgotten by young people, before it ends up on the ash heap of forgotten music history, let's take a moment to mourn one of its last enduring festivals while it's still fresh in our minds. We just might miss it when it's gone.